Welcome to Burning Platforms, our regular look at the politics of technology brought to you by Capita's Centre of the Public Square. I'm Peter Lewis. This week, we look at global efforts to force big tech to pay their share of tax with Dr Mark Zirnsak from the Tax Justice Network. But first, our regular look at the latest tech news with our regular panelists, Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea and Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. So welcome to the virtual transit lounge that is Burning Platforms for another fortnight, racking up the frequent flyer points in Cambridge via Berlin. Digital Rights Watch Chair Lizzie O'Shea. Hey, Lizzie.
Hi, how are you?
And working the digital salt mines, Health Engine CEO Dan Stinton. Hi, Dan.
Hi, Peter. Hi, Lizzie.
And our special guest this fortnight, Dr Mark Zirnsak from the Tax Justice Network, who is going to help us look into some of the global efforts to make big tech pay its share and what the Trump ascendancy might do to those plans. G'day, Mark.
Hi, Peter.
Well, let's start with you, Lizzie. You are in Cambridge at the moment via Berlin. What's going on? Why are you there and what have you learnt on the way?
I've been to a couple of conferences. So I was at the World Forum in Berlin, which is, I suppose it's fair to describe it perhaps as an alternative to the World Economic Forum, but the focus is on building out a society that respects democratic values, and there's a particular focus on tech. And that was 2 days of a lot of talking, including from world leaders who remain now extremely concerned about the United States and its slide towards authoritarianism. So it's a very odd situation where there had been, I think for these people, a big focus on China and Russia as being examples of authoritarian power that were at risk, posing risks to other democracies around the world. And now that has, the focus has heavily turned towards the United States, which I think many Americans are finding difficult to come to terms with, but also people who've worked in all sorts of policy spaces like, consumer rights, children's rights, tech policy generally, cultural analysis of tech policy. So there was a collection of people, I think, who remain extremely concerned. And even at an infrastructure level, like I went to an interesting panel talking about space and communications and just how dominant SpaceX is in, for example, the infrastructure of space for the facilitation of the internet, and what we're going to do about that dominance in the next little while. So that was interesting. And now I'm here at Cambridge for, I think, what is also fair to describe as a slightly more substantive conference with more wonky types and people with very pointy heads who are much cleverer than me. So one of our co-collaborators and a former guest on this podcast, Gina Neff, has put this conference together on technology and democracy, and it feels more than ever that this is a time in which technology and the industry, and well, governments too, but how it's developing is antithetical to democratic values. And I think people are very alarmed. I was talking to a couple of US academics last night who I just think they are extremely concerned about the state of the US. They're in California. They're talking about grave concerns around how that country can function as a single country going forward and what the resistance is going to look like. And one of the things they did remind me of, and this may not be a point that is new to listeners or guests on this podcast, but that there is a huge amount of resistance underway in the US, including large amounts of protest, large amounts of organising lawsuits, and the like, trying to resist Trump, which sometimes doesn't feature as much, I find, in the news that comes out of that country. And it can feel a bit like this administration is much more organised, and the unification of tech industry power with state power is a particularly troubling phenomenon, or the stakes become a lot higher. But, there is a lot of resistance. It's interesting to see how it'll pan out. But that fusion of platform and state power, I think, is particularly problematic for a variety of reasons. But I think there's also this push now into the military sector and a refocusing away from, we'll talk about this, from any kind of safety or public license to operate towards a war footing, really, towards working out how tech can be used to defend security. And it's dark times. So that's what I'm doing, hopefully talking to them about how we can build that kind of resistance.
So part of your whirlwind has been Taiwan a month ago, where Access Now was taking stock of the initial shock of Trump. Now you're in Europe. Do you feel like the balance of, or the center of gravity has moved away? Like all other people you're talking to, particularly from the States, looking at the center of gravity moving away from America into Europe? Notwithstanding that Cambridge isn't really in Europe anymore, is it? It's in Brexit.
No, exactly. Yeah, because Europe's got a different orientation, I think, to somewhere like the UK, which is doing its own kind of withdrawal from AI safety initiatives. They just renamed their safety institute the Security Institute. Like, it's very explicit what they're doing, right? So it's fair to say it's the UK is not Europe. As to what Europe's going to do versus the United States, I think there is a set of people in the US who are very hopeful that there's things that can be done in the US, or they're holding the candle for these kinds of ideas that industry ought to be held accountable, that the technology sector, if let off the leash, will do damaging things that are hard to reverse, that there's climate implications to that as well as human rights implications. But I think in reality, Europe is the entity that is most likely to be able to form some kind of institutional resistance to this that opens up the possibility for, say, somewhere like Australia to do the same. So I think there's a sense that people have to continue doing the work because they don't have a choice in somewhere like the United States. But, personally, it seems to me that it's going to be very difficult to do much there. There is a distinction between, I think, the way Trump talks about things and then what he actually does. And, people probably saw, but I think it was yesterday or the day before, he was talking about rejoining the Commonwealth, which I find grimly amusing. But I think there is some important utility in not spending too much time thinking about his bombast and actually focusing on what someone like JD Vance is doing, because he's much more of the operator, and also what industry is doing because they're organising in their own ways. And it's not, the path to power is not altogether clear. They've got to overcome a lot of obstacles, including industries that don't like what they're doing in the United States. So, there's much to be gained. But I think from a human rights in technology perspective, the interesting time is going to be working out how Europe responds to this, whether they're prepared to do things like repeal the GDPR, repeal the AI Safety Act, whether they can tolerate that. I don't think they will. And that hopefully will be a signal for other powers to continue to seek to protect their own populations against a state and an industry on the ascendancy.
Hey, Lizzie, can I ask, just touching on what you covered a second ago, and the fact that you've gone from Europe's perspective to the UK's perspective, because it seems to me increasingly that the UK is moving closer to the US on technology regulation and away from Europe. And you see this, with the AI Act, I think we spoke about last time, the fact that they're like not going to have any copyright protections, or proposing to not have any copyright protections, and just generally taking a more, liberal approach, or at least less regulatory burden approach to how they're approaching their tech sector. Is that evident in the conversations you're having, or am I on the wrong track?
Yeah, it's funny. Think tanks, like I was talking to the director of Ada Lovelace Institute yesterday, and she's had the exact same conversation where the Americans come to them and go, you need to change your copyright laws, you need to change your planning laws so that we can set up data centers in your country, and you need to do it straight away. And I was like, that is the exact same conversation they're having here, just pushing for investment in your country that comes at a price of your capacity to make
sovereignty
rules about. Yeah. So that I think we're both being treated as outposts of the US empire, right? And I don't think that's bombastic to say that. Like, I think it's accurate. As to whether the UK responds differently, I mean, it is. I don't know. Like, it remains to be seen what our federal government is going to do in response to some of these demands by Trump, because we're in this funny period when an election hasn't been called, but we're clearly having an election. So it's still unclear. But I think many people are quite concerned that the UK is going to do what the US wants. They don't have that inbuilt bureaucratic slowness that accompanies being part of the European Union that might form a buttress against that. Having said that, I do think there are AI industry interests within Europe, particularly in France and Germany, that have their own agendas that they're pushing through Europe that may be in competition with with the United States. And this is also true in relation to the military industry, shall we say, but like that sector, because they're having to rearm and reorganize themselves as against Russia to fill the gap left by the United States essentially withdrawing in substance from NATO. So I do think there's scope for the AI industry or the tech industry within Europe to start organising for the union to do its own work on their behalf. And I think there is still much work for human rights activists to do to shape that in the next little while, even in reaction to some of the more authoritarian tendencies coming out of the US.
Mark, you're part of a global network around tax justice. Is there a similar scramble going on in your community to try to make sense of all the moving pieces and the impact of the gorilla in the room?
Look, in this case, and we'll come to this later, obviously, but in fact, there's kind of been people have sort of been saying, well, the US's behaviour has just removed the gloves from what was expected anyway. The big push that's been happening globally is to move the forum in which global tax regulation gets set to the UN instead of the OECD, which is like the rich countries club. And the fact that the US is now sort of walking away and not playing nice at the OECD has actually strengthened the hand of moving to the UN. So interestingly, it hasn't been as much of a panic. The US, probably up until Biden, has not played nice in the global tax rules anyway. So there's kind of a bit, the veil's been lifted and we can just get on with the reality of what we knew, the way the US has behaved in the tax space.
Great, thanks, Mark. Moving on, Dan. With an election looming, the Australian government has released what it's calling a framework for digital asset platforms, but it's full of keywords like stablecoin, which I'm sure would have grabbed your attention. Now, we know the Trump administration is aggressively promoting crypto. We also know that 1 in 4 Australians say they own a bit, including you. Will this policy send Australia down a similar path?
Just one show I'd like to get through without you referring to the fact that I own crypto.
I did that very politely that time. I didn't even make
that was very respectful, Dan.
There was no bro talk or anything.
You're right. Not yet.
It's very hard for you, Dan. It's very hard.
Okay. Nothing gets me excited like a stablecoin, let me tell you. But
how much have you made this fortnight?
It's more like what I've lost since Trump's come to power. But anyway, we'll move on swiftly because I'd rather not go into any more detail if I can. Yeah. But yes, this is welcome for a dork like me anyway. So yes, a statement on developing an innovative Australian digital asset industry. Look, this is effectively something that the crypto industry community, whatever you want to call it, has been calling for some time. And it basically removes a lot of the regulatory uncertainty that surrounds these digital assets. There are 4 pillars to the government's approach. I'm not going to read through them all because it gets pretty pointy-headed, and we're already pretty much going down that path. So I'll give you the summary if you like, or I'll give you the vibe of the thing. What I really like about this approach is the government is recognising that not all digital assets are the same. So it's leveraging the existing financial services framework for many of the digital assets where it's appropriate, and then it's leaving others to innovate, and it's also not coming up with brand new regulation where it's not needed. So, for example, crypto platforms will need to obtain an Australian financial services license in order to be able to keep operating. That's not new. That makes sense. There's been, they've largely been operating in that way for ages, and this just basically makes it gives them that obligation to qualify for a license. There's a whole bunch of obligations that come with that. And digital assets like tokens or stable coins, they're also going to be classified as financial products. And service providers effectively must follow the same rules that apply to banks or brokers or fund managers. But what this also does is it makes it clear that many digital assets will not be regulated, and they don't really need to be, such as NFTs. Some NFTs still need to be regulated, but if you take an NFT like digital art or a collectible or a ticket, it doesn't give any financial rights like profit sharing or investment, and therefore it doesn't need to be considered a financial product. So, trading a digital artwork on a blockchain doesn't require the financial regulator to get involved, or a concert ticket being traded as an NFT doesn't require that. So I guess, look, the summary is the government is recognising that some digital assets are securities. and therefore require stricter regulation. We'll also realising that existing laws are sufficient for all of them. And others are commodities, things like Bitcoin, and therefore you can leave the market to trade those and innovate and do whatever you want. And I guess this compares with Europe, as we were just talking about before, which has introduced, I think their bill's called MICA is the acronym, Markets in Crypto Asset Regulation, I think. That's created more of a bespoke framework with a huge regulatory burden, which is really failing to do a good job of distinguishing between these two things. And as a result, I think there's going to be a lot less activity in Europe versus a country like Australia. But fire at will.
So is there any risks there around money laundering opportunities that might be being opened up?
Well, probably the reverse, actually, because I think what it's doing is it's recognising that those things which are closer to financial assets will be subject to the same regulatory restrictions or oversight, if you like, as what another one would. So, there's obligations to know your customer, for example, and to minimise the chance of tax evasion or fraud or those sort of things. So it's really just a sensible, it's kind of boring, but it's really just a sensible approach to how to regulate these things, which I think Australia has a good track record of typically being pretty sensible on these things and down the middle. And I think they're demonstrating it here.
Can I say, I find it so funny to think of trading NFTs on the blockchain, like NFT artworks. Like, does anybody still do that? Do you have any NFT artworks, Dan?
We'll continue my full disclosure. No, I don't actually, Lizzie. But
yeah, because they're stupid. So I'm glad. But I do wonder, like what you were saying then about concert tickets. Like, have you ever bought a concert ticket as an NFT? I do wonder about whether I assume consumer law would apply to any business in trade or commerce selling a ticket in that way, but it's more like actually people trading between themselves. And I do wonder whether there's still the potential for things like scams and stuff that would fall probably outside of the consumer protection framework, if substantively, if not formally. So, I assume it's silent on that. It's really trying to, the strategy is about trying to identify which of these are financial products and therefore regulating accordingly. Is that right? Just feels like this is ripe for scams that might not even just be financial products, might just be general consumer products too.
Well, look, there's going to be scams that will exist all the time. If anything, I think this makes it less likely. If you take the concert ticket example, a ticket being issued as an NFT, if a consumer decides that they can't go to a concert or they want to sell it or whatever else, the ability to do that without having to rely on a third party to verify it. There's already so many scams that happen on reselling concert tickets. And if it was sold as an NFT, you don't need a third party to determine that it's an accurate or that it's a real ticket, and they can be, consumers can be free to trade them. It does open up other issues, by the way, because then you have scalpers and all kinds of things. But one problem at a time. This is just one of the applications of many where crypto assets, digital assets, have some real utility where you're not having to rely on a third party to verify the authenticity of something, which I think is going to open up a whole bunch of extra innovation.
I guess it's just like different kinds of risks, and this is regulating for one kind of risk, but I wouldn't want that to be the only way in which these goods and in some cases what amounts to a financial product are regulated, I suppose. Anyway, or ever the critic.
Who's been the driver of this? Do you know, Dan? Like, it feels to me like it's almost an attempt to legitimise the industry, and it's probably aligned to the fact that the banks are investing heavily, and this is almost like its own form of risk that this doesn't sort of open up a competition for them.
Well, it's actually been the industry itself that has been calling for regulation. And again, this is why this is really encouraging and perhaps slightly different to what you're seeing in the US, for example, where you've got the CEO of BTC Markets, I think the biggest crypto trading platform in Australia, has been calling for exactly this regulation, because the problem that they've got, right, is by all reports and accounts, they seem to be a reputable trading platform that does carries out all of the necessary know your customers' requirements and anti-fraud schemes and all the things that we've been talking about. But they're competing with platforms that don't do that because they weren't covered by any regulation. So what this does is hopefully it lifts the standard of the whole industry, and those that aren't going to be able to, that don't comply won't be able to get a license, and therefore will be driven out of business, which is, I think, ultimately a good protection for consumers.
That wasn't that boring.
Same level.
But it is fair to say, though, that there are a range of different regulations that don't apply to this market that do apply to, for example, trading stocks and shares in I mean, what I'm going to call bricks and mortar companies, but what I mean is the stock market as we know it. So, I mean, it's also fair to say there is still an under-regulation of this industry. Like the point about whether this adds a level of credibility to the industry, I mean, it may be well intended, but it does also create the impression that investing in this is equivalent to investing in shares. And I mean, you can have an argument that investing in shares is a form of gambling in and of itself, but this is a less regulated market than investing in publicly listed companies. And I think it is still a situation of buyer beware. There is a huge amount of lawlessness that goes on in crypto land that people should be concerned about. That, I mean, that's the only that's a note of caution I'd add to your optimistic vision of it is an upstanding industry.
Yeah, but that wouldn't
Is
be the
that
first
fair?
time that you and I have taken a slightly one optimistic and one pessimistic view of these things, Lizzie. But yeah, I
Yeah,
guess
well,
so.
I'm not losing money on crypto either. So
No, just me. Just I think I'm the only one on this podcast losing money on crypto. But I'll make one last comment, by the way. Bitcoin, for example, has typically, and in fairness, is still often used as by criminals and whatever for nefarious activities. It's also very traceable and increasingly traceable. So, you know, there's a lot of these criminals that are using Bitcoin because they thought it was this sort of, secure way that governments could not track. The opposite is actually being found out to be the case now. And so I think that, you know, the more you're right, this industry is still under-regulated relative to the rest of the financial services market, but this is exactly a step in the right direction to mitigate that problem.
Cool. I'm going to move on. It's book club time. This is what I read over the weekend. Careless People, A Story of Where I Used to Work by Sarah Wynne Williams. This is the ultimate corporate kiss and tell. And the reason I just wanted to bring it up is for a number of reasons. One is some of the revelations in the book, which are both highly disturbing and hugely banal, but also what Facebook/Meta has done to try to silence the author. So Sarah Wynne Williams was a New Zealand diplomat who pitched herself as Facebook's diplomat in the early wide-eyed days of Facebook, I think 2014. She was there for the ride where Facebook got bigger. They started building relationships with governments. And there were a few really revealing things in the book that are worth noting because, again, as a story, it feels more real than some of the reports that have come out over the years. But three big takeouts. One is that the motivation from Facebook from day one was growth over any other form of responsibility. The second was that politicians in countries, whether they were democratic or autocratic, were seen as potential customers. So the diplomacy that was, to the extent it's a company engaging with government, was teaching them how to use the tools to get them elected, and arguably at times using the algorithm to help them get elected. And then just a real push to do whatever China wanted to get in there, which of course hasn't been ultimately successful, but they were prepared to trade in any sort of democratic value to do so. But probably the most concerning bit, and I don't know if you've read the book yet, Lizzie, or seen extracts, the reports of what was happening in Myanmar, which was seen as a real target for Facebook because of the huge population and it was one of those internet.org experiments where the internet is Facebook and you just sort of open up connectivity through Facebook. The point at which they were getting reports of the Rohingya riots and then the massacres, Facebook had one person who spoke Burmese who was a contractor in Ireland. And when there was riots on the street, Sarah writes that she's trying to contact somebody to verify and get the content pulled down. And the sole contractor who speaks Burmese is having dinner in a restaurant and wouldn't be home for a couple of hours and then couldn't access their PC. So people are literally dying because of the inability of this company to take any sort of responsibility. So the idea of the carelessness really comes through, and just the not caring whatsoever. And of course, the ultimate in this book, which is also really revealing, is they've taken legal action against the author promoting the book, which has catapulted it to the top of the bestseller list because it's created its own. But it is an incredibly well-written book. If half of what's in there actually happened, you've got to say this company has grown far beyond its maturity. And, if we're looking now at where Zuckerberg is in terms of the tech libertarianism, it's kind of like the obvious endpoint of where this company started. And so much of the hype around connecting the world for good was always BS. So, I just think that sometimes, we've had Frances Haugen, who's given previous testimony to how cynically they disregarded evidence of the damage algorithms were doing to different audiences, but this on a global scale, really, really concerning. Also, some great anecdotes, and you can probably flesh these out a bit. Facebook's tax deal with Ireland, where it's basically worked out over drinks with the Irish president, but just desperate post GFC to have Facebook's headquarters there. They would write in the tax laws basically to ensure that that would be the place that would be Facebook's haven, Mark.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. What motivated Sarah to write the book, given she worked for them?
She's resigned. She resigned. I mean, I think this.
Well, she resigned from my reading of it, she ends up making the relationships break down, particularly with Joe Kaplan, who is a Republican operative who sort of takes the main job in terms of public affairs. She lodges complaints. The complaints are not upheld, and then she's shown the door. She's a whirlwind of she's the least diplomatic diplomat I've ever read. But it's so revealing. It's like this car crash. I'm not sure who the good people are in here, and I'm not even sure if the author's one of them or not. But it is just a wild ride of a lack of, it's that classic thing where you are what the objectives you set are. So the objectives you set are growth, and everything else sits under that. And in a machine that's getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that creates all these consequences where, other things just aren't on the map.
She has copped a bit of criticism. It's called Careless People, but I mean, it's reckless. It's not careless. It's not as though I think anybody in that company knew there weren't problems like this. And, they'd set up the company operating in Myanmar, Burma, and had not, compared to Germany, where there were thousands of people who were doing content moderation in language, they did not care. It is like a colonial enterprise, I think, in that sense. They are focused on growth. They're focused on setting up shop. They're completely indifferent to the interests of the local population, to the point where they don't even care what language they speak. It is. And also, they don't think rules apply. I think there's this weird mentality where, I'm sorry, I haven't actually read the book, but I've read extracts and analysis.
You've got the vibe. I've got the vibe.
I've got a copy, but I haven't managed to read it yet. But I think that interesting idea that the only rules that apply really are US law and the rules of growth and capitalism, and then I think that's partly what motivates. There's a sense of lawlessness to them, that they're on a colonial adventure. That's the impression I get. But there is some criticism of her, including other employees of Facebook, who say that she knew about some of these concerns and didn't take them seriously herself. I get the impression from the text as well that it's quite, or the extracts that I've read, that there's a relatively kind of lightheartedness, aloofness to it that I think is a bit disquieting, because it's hard to read or think about some of these topics, particularly Myanmar, and not think, wow, this should be accompanied by a real sense of shame. This is a terrible chapter, not just in the company's history, which is already pretty bad, but also just in humanity, that you've been involved in this. And I do, I sometimes get my back up about these kinds of accounts, of which this is not the first. Many people have come out of Facebook and written these kinds of stories. And there is this we've had Maria Sullivan on this show that she wrote that article about the prodigal tech bro, where they go in and they, they drink the Kool-Aid and then they come out and go, oh, this is terrible, and then write a story about it. And I mean, I think there's enough people that see already what they're doing and try and work against it without the need to have the experience of going in there and the shenanigans that happen. So I, like, in that sense, sometimes I feel like these narratives get greater weight in circumstances where regulators, company officials have been known to be not doing what they should for a long time, and this is not revealing in that sense. But anyway, like, having said that, an insider account of how you negotiate tax deals, particularly, Mark, I think it's relevant for you, but there's this that is really important. Like, the way in which they own governments in like Ireland, particularly a small government that is set up as a tax haven for these companies, has a small number of employees relative to the size of the corporation and the money coming through that jurisdiction. The things that they do, it's just we really need to talk more about the need for countries to make their own rules and hold large, transnational corporations like this to account. It's not good enough for the local population. It's not good enough for people who have to deal with their systems.
Meta's not solo on this, as you and I know, Lizzie. I mean, the whistleblower who dumped a whole lot of documents with the International Consortium of Investigative Journalists about Uber and the way it was set up and the tactics it used. I was struck as you were speaking, Peter, about the parallels to that. And in that case, the whistleblower too, I think, went along with all the shenanigans of Uber, and it was only when there's sort of a falling out between him and them. That's why I was sort of asking about Sarah. He sort of, decides he will lift the lid on how it was set up and the activities they involved in. And again, they were able to push governments around, set up illegally, get laws changed to meet their business model, dump the drivers in for tax while avoiding paying tax themselves.
Feels a little bit like what we're going through right now, in fact, with the AI industry, dare I say it. So,
But also, if there's a moral to this story, it is that these companies should have to comply with the laws of the companies they operate in. And Dan, it's so unsurprising that this is a culture that led to Facebook turning off news, but also domestic violence support and the Weather Bureau in Australia because they weren't getting their way. Like, these are like kids running this big enterprise with huge consequence.
I was going to make exactly that comparison, actually. I mean, I think the revelations of the book are not that new, really. I mean, perhaps there's more insight, and I guess the author was very senior and probably the most senior account from inside this company. But coming back to that point, I mean, what I found most interesting, and again, I haven't read the book, but I have listened to, I think, one of the few interviews.
What a great podcast we've got here.
Well, I did listen to the interview that she gave with Barry Weiss at the Free Press. I think it's one of the few ones that she gave
before she got silenced. Yeah,
got silenced, and it was pretty revealing. And that really focused on just the efforts that Facebook was going to in order to get into the Chinese market. A market where, by the way, they still earn $18 billion from Chinese advertisers, even though they don't operate there. So it's a very important part of their business. But you compare just how much, according to her account at least, how much Mark and Cheryl were prepared to compromise and the like in order to try and secure access to the Chinese market. And then you can compare that to them throwing their toys out of the pram when they had to throw a few shekels to the news media in Australia. I mean, the contrast is remarkable. And again, I think it just demonstrates if there's a shitload of money to be made in one country, then all bets are off. Whereas if it's a relatively small market like Australia, then, hey, let's make an example of them because we've got bigger fish to fry. And I think it just demonstrates that really, perhaps we shouldn't be surprised by this, it's a publicly listed company, but really it is all about maximising profit and the need for, any sort of moderation on that in order to comply for any moral obligations seems to be absent. And that's been the consistent message, I guess, of every whistleblower that's come out of Facebook, is that this is how they operate. So again,
interestingly, if you have your super in an ethical fund, I bet you've got Meta and Alphabet shares. Like, that is if you don't like your money going into coal, that's where they park it in these companies.
And I am one of those people, and that is still the case. So it's you have to sort of question, I guess. I think it's beyond questioning they should not be part of those ethical funds, I think, when you're having things like this going on.
Oh, the bottom would fall out of the ethical funds if they weren't. But maybe that's a discussion for another day. Let's talk about tax now. So, Mark, thanks for joining us. I invited you to come onto the pod after hearing you speak at Per Capita's recent Community Tax Summit, which talking about the work being done, at least to attempt to get big tech platforms to pay. And what's interesting is this isn't at the moment just a case of something should be done. There are live processes in place to develop and embed digital services taxes. It's just really hard to enforce, and I expect harder than ever post-Trump. So maybe you could start off by telling us a little bit about your work with the Tax Justice Network and the journey to date to get taxes to stick with big tech.
Yeah, look, I mean, the Tax Justice Network globally, so I'm with Tax Justice Network Australia. Tax Justice Network globally came out of that there was a lot of work being done to try and improve the situation for global south countries. And there were sort of development experts were sort of a bit puzzled with, the assistance that was going in as overseas development aid and the lack of benefit. And when there was sort of tracing done of this, the origin sort of showed the amount of money flowing out of the global south, particularly Africa, far outweighed what was coming in. And most of what was flowing out was through tax avoidance and tax evasion by multinational corporations. Now, in this case, not all tech companies, a lot of them resources companies, whether they were mining companies or agricultural global giants. So that's sort of the origins of it. For myself, my getting into this was I was part of the Make Poverty History, and there was a sort of Christian arm of that, the MICA Challenge. These were sort of campaigns targeted on getting the Millennium Development Goals implemented and overcoming global poverty. And we were sparked at the time. There was sort of a counter in Australia. The Centre for Independent Studies was running a line that we shouldn't get any overseas assistance to global south countries because it only props up their corrupt governments and it disincentivises the population from taking action to overthrow their corrupt governments. And there were lots of problems with that narrative because, firstly, not all those governments are corrupt, and secondly, the small amount of overseas development aid was never going to disincentivise people if they were truly able to mount resistance. But it did lead us to have a look at, and we sort of said, well, okay, let's see what role do wealthy countries, global north countries like Australia play in combating corruption globally, but also in potentially facilitating it, benefiting from it and rewarding it. And what came out of looking at that was that global tax avoidance and tax evasion by multinational corporations swamped any overall look at corruption outflows by corrupt dictators. Now, it did vary from country to country, but if you looked at it in net terms, what was going on with tax avoidance and tax evasion was just sort of completely outrageous in that space. That said, I mean, the Tax Justice Network as a movement has led to really major reforms, and the problem has certainly curbed quite a bit of tax avoidance, tax evasion. Unfortunately, most of the benefit has flowed only to the global north countries. And again, the global south have largely missed out on many of the benefits from this crackdown on tax avoidance. But at the moment, we are certainly seeing, the tech companies are definitely still out there to try and avoid paying taxes, and are now under the Trump administration really pushing back to try and avoid paying taxes where they can.
Do you see the tech companies as being different to other big global corps? Is there a difference, or are they just another big global multinational?
Look, others are using their technique. I mean, the strategy they've always had, and it's particularly been a problem with the US because the US doesn't have controlled foreign corporation rules that other countries. Now, what that means, that's a technical sort of thing there. If an Australian company makes profits overseas, and it doesn't pay tax overseas, we have laws that require them to, if you're headquartered here, you have to onshore the money to Australia, and then you have to pay the tax here. So if you pay tax overseas, you get to discount it off the tax you would pay here. But by and large, you end up having to onshore your money. Now, the US doesn't have those rules. So what it created is a massive incentive for US companies to basically park their profits offshore in places that with governments that have been willing to cut special deals where they pretty much pay very little or no tax at all. So the last time Trump was in, so not this administration, but the previous one, the tech companies between them had $1 trillion stashed offshore that they weren't bringing onshore to the US. Because if they bring it onshore, then they've got to pay the US corporate tax rate. So by parking it offshore, you can avoid paying tax. And then the game would be, and they did this under the first Trump administration, you lobby for a tax holiday. So, and US administrations have done this where they say, well, if you now bring your money onshore, we'll give you a discounted rate of tax. So you avoid having to pay a whole lot of tax by doing that. But that failure to see any proper tax paid on those revenues has sparked a whole lot of other governments to feel like these companies are getting away with not having to pay tax anywhere. And therefore, and particularly where, the game here has been like, you sell, you're buying, like in Australia, we're buying advertising with one of the platforms, and the platform will say, well, that transaction took place in Ireland, or that transaction took place in the Netherlands, where there's a special deal, and they pay no tax. And the Australian government, if you'd bought that, if you'd walked into a newspaper here and you buy an ad, the revenues here, the newspaper's got to pay tax on the profit from that advertising, whereas these platforms, by offshoring, that it's created a special loophole to avoid paying tax. But look, other companies have now picked up on the tech companies' technique of that sort of tax avoidance.
Mark, can I ask? Sorry, jump in, Lizzie. Why? Help me understand. Why doesn't the US introduce a tax framework similar to what Australia has? Like, isn't it unambiguously in their interests to have a circumstance where those companies, where they're not having to offer tax holidays to bring that $1 trillion home? Like, why is this a controversial tax reform that the US can't bring in?
Well, I think you've got division within the US population. No surprises there. I mean, you're going to have plenty of people who run with this, I think very distorted view that all tax is theft. Don't like paying tax anywhere, and there'll be, you end up with US administrations that have this sort of, split personality approach to tax collection as such, and it is quite split personality because I think the Internal Revenue Service, in some ways, has been quite good at going after tax avoiders and tax evaders, and has sometimes led the world in pursuing that, particularly when they went after the Swiss banks, for example. But when it's come to their own tech companies, there's been a special ride granted. Now, I can't tell you whether that's because the tech companies have been great lobbyists, or, certainly when the companies were first set up, there was a view you wanted to foster innovation by giving them an easy run. Whether there's still a legacy on that. But no, those rules to force them to bring it onshore, there's been no serious momentum to see those get up within and pass within Congress, and certainly not at the moment.
There is this view, I'm interested to hear your take on this, Mark, but also solving this problem is impossible because the worst rules in terms of taxing companies from a citizen's perspective are always the ones that a company will chase. So if you can't address tax havens, then what's the point of trying to regulate to improve taxation rules in your own jurisdiction? I remember, I think France had, I don't know where they're up to, but they'd proposed a tax on revenue for tech companies rather than profit because that was perceived as a better way to kind of account for the economic activity within their own borders rather than allowing them to offshore profits and therefore reduce their tax liability. But this was seen as a very move that would be diplomatically difficult to sustain, and particularly under the Trump administration, that's become harder. But before we talk about Trump, particularly on that point, what is this a solvable problem? It seems to me that there are policies in place that could fix it, but there is this perception that it's impossible to do.
So a couple of things to say there. So firstly, there are currently 30 governments that have introduced digital services taxes. So effectively those taxes are levied on, they can either be on sales, so they might be, or you're getting revenue from our citizens by selling them advertising, we'll tax you on that. But it can also be if you've collected citizens' data and you on-sell that data to someone else, the digital services tax might apply to you. There are others for harvesting, gaining a benefit to the corporation from simply harvesting people's data, even if you're not on-selling it. So there's a whole range of these taxes that have been set up. Typically, they're about they're typically around 3 to 4%, but range from 1.5 to 7.5% of those revenues. So that was what was happening. So you were starting to see all these governments introducing their own taxes, saying, well, these tech corps are getting away with not paying tax anywhere, so we're gonna hit them because they're basically making money off our citizens. In response to that, there's been an OECD international initiative which ended up it was stalled for a while, and then the Biden administration came along and realised that we don't want this patchwork of all these digital services taxes. If one thing corporates hate is double taxation, the idea that you would pay tax on the same set of profits twice, and there was a real risk of that sort of multiple profits being taxed multiple times. With all these digital services taxes being introduced by all these different governments. So an international agreement was reached and it was sort of labelled Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 was quite complex, and it was designed exactly to catch digital services, and the idea was to figure out what bit of the profits had been untaxed and then allocate taxing rights to certain countries through a fairly complex formula. The formula was largely going to benefit global north countries. And then there was a Pillar 2, and the Pillar 2 basically said for huge corporations, there's going to be a minimum global tax rate of 15%. And the US, under the Biden administration, they actually pushed for it to be higher than 15, but 15 was the compromise. And some of the Europeans and the islands of the world wanted lower than 15. But that agreement would mean, and we've now introduced laws in Australia that will allow this. It means if a company is paying less than an effective tax rate of 15% globally, certain countries can claim the right to tax the untaxed portion to top up their overall. So that's the way then to defeat the tax havens, the secrecy jurisdictions, is because if I'm as a government offer you a special tax deal, but at the end of the day some other government's going to top it up, I've got nothing to sell you, right? Because you're going to pay the tax somewhere. You just may not pay it to me. So the incentive to do the special deals starts to vanish, and that was the global. Now that is the thing that within a short period of getting into office, that is the thing Trump has now torn up and walked away from.
Explain what Trump and the tech bros are doing to undermine this now.
Yeah, so what he 20th of January, he indicated they were going to walk away. And what that led to was immediately France and Italy said, right, we're going to ramp up our digital services taxes. So on 21st of Feb, Trump then announced he ordered a special digital service tax tariff retaliation inquiry targeting six countries: France, UK, Italy, Canada, Spain, among them. And there's currently submissions being taken, and the outcome of that review will come out in April. And the expectation is it's going to look at, well, how do we punish these governments that have, and they've as I said, they've started with a number of the European governments. There are governments in Asia and Africa that have also got these digital service taxes. So it does feel like they've picked some targets initially to go after. There's already, the UK government has already been publicly speculating they may dump their digital service tax before the outcome of the review is even completed to avoid being subject to the punishment. Now, their digital service tax currently collects $1.4 billion out in our terms for the UK revenue, and it appears that's money they're willing to forego under fear of what the retaliation might look like. The reviews also sort of broadened it out. It's going to look at, do EU and UK regulations pressure US companies to have to do things in relation to content moderation, and does that stifle political freedom and freedom of expression? Now, to my mind, there strikes me as a fair bit of irony about this, because I'm wondering what kind of political freedom is being defended here, given the administration. Even just today, there was the announcement they're cutting research funding to Australian universities if those universities have diversity and inclusion policies. So there's a pretty harsh punishment regime being inflicted if you don't have the right political ideology, while asserting that EU and UK regulation of the online world is stifling political freedom in that space.
What are the decision points Australian leaders are going to be asked to make over the coming months in the face of these sorts of challenges, Mark?
Australia had previously had been moving down the path of introducing a digital services tax. And then when the agreement was reached through the OECD to have this sort of Pillar 1, Pillar 2 arrangement, it got suspended. So it's still hanging in the background. So it'd be interesting to see whether we would have a government bold enough to say, well, we're going to dust it off and reintroduce it. I suspect that might be a bridge too far, given the US administration's willingness at the moment to use trade as a tool for punishment. It's a lot of uncertainty.
So what should we do, Mark? What should Australia do?
Well, I think it would make sense to band together with other governments and to sort of stand up to the US over this issue. I think ultimately, as others have said, tariffs will eventually hurt the US people as well in this space. So there's a limit, to how far that tool can be used as a bat to try and beat the rest of the world to the will of the Trump administration. But as long as, the threat of introducing them, if that bends other governments to your will, well, then you don't suffer the consequence of introducing the tariffs back on yourself. But I do think, there is a move to have this UN forum to set up the global tax rules. I think Australia should get behind that. Currently, it's not willing to do that. It feels the OECD is the right forum. Still, I think the pushback from the global south is, well, the OECD is the rich countries club, so it's not super fair. I think the thing you need to overcome in the UN, and my understanding is the movement is in this direction. You can't have a consensus model for these kind of tax rules, because otherwise, you get you potentially have an island, or you have a Cayman Islands or a British Virgin Islands who will simply destroy consensus because they've got a vested interest in not seeing good global tax rules, because a model of assisting corporates in tax avoidance brings them revenue.
Yeah, it's particularly difficult, though, with the UN as well, given that the US is the largest donor to a lot of programs and is pulling out. In some ways that's an opportunity, right? Because it means that that influence is not being exercised in the same way. And it puts all the other countries to task in terms of figuring out what this should look like with the US not involved. And maybe that's a more conducive environment for figuring out some of these questions. I'm a bit loath to suggest this, but one of the other things that comes to mind is things that are taxed that don't look like tax, something like, dare I say it, the News Media Bargaining Code, which is like a private transfer of money between two industries, right, or two companies within the same industry, but is designed to address the problem of that tax sometimes seeks to solve about excessive profits and the impact on a particular industry. Do you think there is scope for things other than taxes on revenues or other kinds of methodologies that might be also worth exploring at this point as a to satisfy or to reach the objectives of tax being like a social justice kind of issue or an inequality issue? Are there other things beyond what we're talking about now that you think might be worth pursuing?
Look, those digital services taxes have got a wide variety of design, and quite a number of them are targeting revenue, or they're targeting estimates of what the benefits have been as well. So I think we have seen some sort of innovative, but that's not going to stop the tech companies. That if they're paying out, they're going to scream to the Trump administration to punish the government that's doing it. So I don't know there is an easy way around that. No matter what mechanism you came up with, that ability for them to run to the Trump administration to look after the interests is still there. I would go back on the UN. We have seen models, though. If you think about, very much off the tech platform space, but when you had the vast majority of the governments around the world wanted a ban on anti-personnel landmines, they stepped outside of the UN. Canada led what was called the Ottawa process, and we ended up with a treaty that effectively banned anti-personnel landmines. The US stayed outside of that treaty, but it's had enormous impact, and it then came back into the UN. So it now is, and it did modify the US's behaviour. I mean, the US down the track, did modify. I mean, the other thing here, obviously, to say too is we have to put up with Trump, hopefully only for another 4 years, despite fantasies of some of his supporters. So hopefully, we're not. This isn't hopefully a permanent change in the field.
JD
And tax is
Vance is
often
gonna
a
be
very
so much better.
long reform area.
Yeah, I'm just saying because JD Vance is going to be so much better. Anywho, we might wind it up at that point. Thanks for taking us through that, Mark. And Lizzie, good luck at Cambridge. Hope you come back with some more interesting ideas and stories to share. And Dan, thanks as always. We'll put a pin in it for this week there, but thanks everyone for being part of Burning Platforms. You've been listening to Burning Platforms. It was recorded on March 24 and produced on Naarm land by Rebecca Connell. Talk again soon.